Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. My name is Tara, and each week I'll be reading a selection of creepypastas, urban legends, and other scary stories that I've translated from Japanese. If you'd like to know more, you can visit us at our website at kowabana.net. Our first story this week is one of my favorites, and perhaps one of the most well-known legends to come out of Japan in recent years. So, without further ado, let's get right to it. Hasshaku-sama. My father's parents' house was a little less than 2 hours away by car. It was a farming house, but I liked that sort of thing. So when I started high school and got a bike, I often went on trips there by myself during the holidays. Both my grandfather and my grandmother happily welcomed me. "We're so glad to see you." But the last time I went there was just before I started the 3rd grade of high school, so I haven't been there in over 10 years now. It's not that I won't go, but rather, I can't go. It was the start of the spring vacation, and the weather was perfect, so I got on my bike and went to my grandfather's house. It was still a little cold, but the veranda was pleasantly warm, so I relaxed there for a while. Then, pop, 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 pop. I heard this strange noise. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like it was coming from a person. It was kind of like a voiced and half-voiced sound at the same time. What was that? I wondered. And then I saw a hat over the top of the garden hedge. Why was there a hat there? It started to move sideways, and once it reached a gap, I saw a woman. Ah, so it was a woman wearing the hat. She was also wearing a white one-piece dress. But the hedge was about 2 meters tall. If I could see her head over the top of it, just how tall was she? I was shocked, but she started moving again, and both she and the hat disappeared from view. At some point the pop, pop, pop sound also stopped. I didn't think much more of it at the time. Maybe it was just a tall woman wearing high heels, or even perhaps a tall man dressed up as a woman. I was drinking tea in the living room later on when I told my grandparents about what I saw. There was this really big woman. I wonder if it was a man cross-dressing. They just replied, "Oh yeah." She was bigger than the hedge. She was wearing a hat and was making this strange sound like paw, paw, paw. The moment I said it, the two of them froze. Like they stopped moving at the exact same time. My grandfather's face contorted with rage, and he bombarded me with questions. "When did you see her? Where did you see her? How much taller than the hedge was she?" I answered his barrage of questions, and then he suddenly fell silent. He went to the phone in the hallway and called someone. The sliding door was closed, so I couldn't hear what he was saying very well, but my grandmother was visibly shaken. Having finished his phone call, my grandfather returned. "You'll stay here tonight. There's no way we can let you return. Not now," he said. I was worried. Have I done something wrong? But I couldn't think of anything. It's not like I sought the woman out. She was the one who appeared to me. Then my grandfather said, "Grandma, I'm leaving him to you now. I'm gonna pick up Kei-san," and took off in his truck. I nervously asked my grandmother what was going on, and she said in a trembling voice, "It seems you've been cursed by Hasshaku-sama. Your grandfather's gonna do something about it. There's no need to worry." She told me little by little until my grandfather returned. In this area there was a being called Hasshaku-sama. Hasshaku-sama took on the appearance of a tall woman. Just like her name suggested, she was about 8 feet tall, and she had a strange, manly laugh that sounded like pop, 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 Depending on the person, she might appear as a young woman in a morning dress, an old lady in a formal kimono, or even a middle-aged woman in farm clothes. While her appearance was always different, there were three things she always had in common: her incredible height, her hat, and her strange laugh. In the past there were rumors of her being a cursed traveler, but nobody knew for sure. She was sealed in the village by Jizo statues, so she was unable to leave. Those who were cursed by Hasshaku-sama were always killed within a few days. The last time she hurt someone was 15 years earlier. I heard this after the fact, but apparently Hasshaku-sama could only leave the village by certain paths in the north, south, east, and west. And so Jizo statues were placed on those particular paths to seal her in. As to why they would even want to keep Hasshaku-sama trapped there, apparently the old residents had an arrangement with the nearby villages, where they got priority to water rights and other such things. Hasshaku-sama only appeared to bother people once every 10 or so years, so the people who lived there in the past found it to be an advantageous deal. But even hearing all that, I thought there was no way it could be real. Of course not. Before long, my grandfather returned with an old woman in tow. "Well, haven't you gotten yourself into a fine mess? Here, take this," the old lady said, and handed me a talisman. Then she went upstairs with my grandfather, while my grandmother stayed behind with me. Even when I went to the toilet, she wouldn't let me close the door the whole way. For the first time since I got there, I started to think that maybe I really was in danger. A short while later, they called me up to the second floor and put me in a room. The windows were entirely covered over with newspaper and talismans, and there were piles of salt in all four corners. There was a small wooden box, not really big enough to call an altar, and on top of it was a small statue of Buddha. I didn't know where they came from, but 2 bedpans had been prepared as well. I was supposed to go in those? My grandfather turned to me with a serious look on his face. "The sun's about to set. Listen to me carefully. You can't leave this room until tomorrow morning. Neither myself nor your grandmother will call you or try to speak to you, okay? You must, under no circumstances, leave this room until 7 a.m. tomorrow. Only then can you come out. I'll call and let your parents know what's happening." I could do nothing but nod silently in agreement. "Make sure you do exactly as you're told, and keep that talisman close as well. If anything happens, go and pray before the Buddha statue," Kei-san said. They said I could have the TV on, but even as I tried to watch it, my mind wandered, and I couldn't focus. I didn't feel like eating the rice balls or snacks my grandmother prepared for me, so I just got into bed and lay there, trembling. At some point I fell asleep, but when I woke up, some late-night TV program was on. I looked at my watch. It was past 1 a.m. Oh, what an awful time to wake up, I thought, when suddenly I heard something hitting the window. It wasn't like the sound of a small rock. It was more like a finger rapping across the surface. I couldn't decide whether it was the wind or someone actually tapping, so I tried my best to convince myself that it was the former. Then I heard my grandfather's voice. "Hey, are you okay? Don't push yourself too hard if you're scared, alright?" Without thinking, I walked towards the door, but then I remembered what my grandfather said. "What's wrong? You can come out if you want." The voice sounded exactly like my grandfather, but it wasn't him. I didn't know why, but I just knew, and as I realized, I got goosebumps. I looked over at the pile of salt in the corner, and the top had turned black. I ran at full speed to the Buddha statue and sat down in front of it. Grasping the talisman, I started to pray as hard as I could. Please, help me. Then, pop, 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 pop. I heard that voice and a sound at the window. Dun-dun, dun-dun. I knew she wasn't that tall, but I couldn't stop picturing her in my mind reaching up from below and tapping on the window. There was nothing I could do but keep praying in front of the statue. The night felt unbelievably long, but eventually morning came, and the TV started playing the morning news. The time in the corner of the screen said 7:13 a.m. I hadn't even noticed, but both the tapping on the glass and the voice had stopped. It seemed I'd either fallen asleep or passed out. The pile of salt had turned even more black. Just in case, I looked at my own watch, and it said roughly the same time as the TV, so I nervously opened the door. Both my grandmother and Kei-san were standing there, looking worried. My grandmother was crying. "Oh, thank God." When I went downstairs, my father was there. My grandfather appeared from outside and told me to hurry up, get in the car. I didn't know where it came from, but when I went out into the garden, there was a minivan surrounded by several men. It fit 9 people. I was put in the middle seat. Kei-san sat in the passenger seat, and the rest of the men got in and surrounded me. There were 9 of us in total. I was surrounded in all directions. An old man sitting to my right turned to me. "It's terrible, isn't it? You'll probably be curious about what's going on, but I want you to close your eyes and keep your head down. We won't be able to see anything, but maybe you will. Until we say it's okay, just keep your eyes shut." Then my grandfather got in his mini truck and took the lead, followed by the van I was in, and my father followed behind us as we set off. The line of cars drove rather slowly. They couldn't have been going more than 20 kilometers per hour. Before long, Kei-san muttered, "This is the hard part," and the men started chanting a Buddhist prayer. Po po po, 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 po po po. I heard that voice again. I gripped the talisman Kei-san gave me, closed my eyes and put my head down. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened my eyes just a little to look outside. I saw a white dress. It was moving alongside the car. She was following with such long strides. Her head was above the window, so I couldn't see it, but she started bobbing up and down, like she was trying to see inside the car. Unconsciously, I screamed out. "Don't look!" the man next to me yelled. In a panic, I squeezed my eyes shut and gripped the talisman even tighter. Kotsit! 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 A tapping sound on the window began. The men in the car also gasped in fear. Even though they couldn't see or hear her, they could hear the sound on the window. Kei-san started praying even harder. Finally, when everything seemed to get quiet, Kei-san turned around. We got away. The men around me, who had been quiet until that point, were visibly relieved. Oh, we did it. Soon after, the van stopped on a wide part of the road, and I got into my father's car. As my father and grandfather bowed to the other men, Kei-san came over and asked me to show her the talisman. I was still gripping it unconsciously, but when I looked at it, it was entirely black. Kei-san gave me a new one and said, "I think it's okay now, but you should keep this for a little while longer, just in case." After that, I returned home with my father. A few days later, my grandfather and one of his neighbors brought my bike back. It turned out my father also knew about Hasshaku-sama, and he told me about one of his childhood friends who had been killed by her. He even knew of people that had to move away and live in other places because of her curse. The men who rode in the car were all related to my grandfather in some way, which meant that they were all loosely my blood relatives as well. Of course, my grandfather in the front and my father in the back were also connected to me by blood, so they were all meant to confuse Hasshaku-sama away from me. My uncles were unable to reach us with only a single night's notice, so my grandfather gathered whatever blood relatives he could, no matter how loosely related we were. Even so, gathering so many men at once was impossible, and thinking it much safer to leave during the day than at night, I was kept in that room until morning. In a worst-case scenario, I heard both my father and grandfather were prepared to sacrifice themselves to help me escape. After I returned home, I spoke to my grandfather on the phone. I asked him if he spoke to me during the night, but he said that he didn't. So then, it really was... I got chills down my spine thinking about it again. Now, as I explained earlier, I make sure not to go back there anymore. My grandfather died 2 years ago, and of course I wasn't able to attend his funeral. Even when he was no longer able to get out of bed, he demanded I stay away. 10 years passed since the events of that day, and just as I was about to forget what happened, I got a phone call. It was my grandmother. One of the Jizo statues keeping Hasshaku-sama in the village broke. It's the one leading towards your house. I've been trying to tell myself it's nothing more than a superstition, but I still find myself getting more and more worried. When I think about hearing that pop 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 voice again. So this story first appeared on the internet in 2008. Supposedly 10 years after the author went to visit his grandparents. While the author was never heard from again, Hasshaku-sama went on to become an urban legend in her own right. Kind of like a female Japanese Slender Man. If you're going to Google her, however, beware. Don't say I didn't warn you. Our next story is about a grandfather and the spooky experience he had as a child. An experience that still haunts him to this day. This one is called On a Dark Country Road. This is a story my grandfather told me. I'll do my best to remember it all. His name was Shinji, so I called him Shinji. One day Shinji told me a strange story. This was the only time he ever told me such a story, before he died several years ago. When Shinji was around 6 or 7 years old, he had an older brother who died from sickness. Shinji's father wanted him to spend his final days at home, and so the family cared for him there. Shinji used to happily play with his older brother, until one day his father asked him to stop. His brother was just too sick. Then one night, his brother died. It was summer, and the house had no air conditioning. Not wanting the weather to damage his brother's body, Shinji's father decided to take him to the closest place to do the funeral rites right away. Shinji's house was way out in the middle of nowhere, a place so countryside that roads big enough for cars didn't even exist. With no other way to get there, their father decided that he would have to carry his brother. Shinji went with him, holding a torch to light their way. While shining the torch in front of them, Shinji walked alongside his father, his brother's dead body on his back. On a quiet country road during the middle of the night, they didn't see anyone. All they could hear were the sounds of bugs chirping and their own feet on the gravel below. The pair walked in silence. Shinji said his father looked extremely tired. After they walked for a while, they saw someone in the distance. It seemed like the person was walking in the same direction as them, but they were moving slowly. Shinji didn't think too much about it and figured they'd catch up in time. And when they did, he casually cast his torch over the person's back. His breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that outfit somewhere before. He quickly remembered where. It was the same outfit that his brother was wearing on their father's back right now. His father noticed at the same time and whispered to him sharply, "Shinji, don't shine that!" He quickly lowered the torch and shone it on their own feet. Because the figure was walking slower than them, they slowly began to close the distance. Shinji started to get scared and wanted to stop walking, but whenever he did, he realized the figure in front of them stopped walking too. His father had probably realized the same thing. Slowly they got closer. The person was just as tall as his brother. Before long he saw the person's feet. He was barefoot. Even though the road wasn't paved, there were no marks or injuries on his feet. They got even closer. He could see shorts. He knew those pants. They were green shorts with cuffs. He also saw the shirt. It was a blue and white striped shirt. It was his brother's favorite. He saw the back of his head. At that moment, his father grabbed his shoulder and said, "Don't look! Shinji, don't look!" Shinji was slightly curious, but he cast his eyes down. His father was muttering something. He couldn't hear it very well, but it sounded like a prayer. They finally closed the distance, and Shinji and his father walked side by side with it. His father continued praying. Shinji kept repeating to himself not to look, but as soon as they stood side by side, he realized that it was looking at him. He said that the power behind his gaze was amazingly strong. Finally, the two of them overtook it. But that, Shinji said, was when it got really scary. When they passed it, that is to say, it was now behind them, that's when it happened. They couldn't hear any footsteps, but it was definitely there, right behind them. He could feel it staring at them. My great-grandfather, Shinji's father, said, "Don't look back, Shinji. Whatever you do, don't look back." Shinji couldn't even look at his father next to him, let alone at what was behind him. The reason for that was what his father was carrying on his back. The two of them kept on walking down that country road with something following close behind. He just looked straight ahead and prayed they'd reach a place full of people soon. He didn't know when the figure behind them might call out his name or suddenly jump on him. So with his heart racing, he kept on walking. But in the end, the figure didn't call out his name or rush to attack him. The two of them arrived safely at their destination, delivered his brother's body to the morgue, and returned home. Shinji said there was nothing on the road on their way back. When I asked if it was really his brother, he acted like he didn't know. He only said this: "Ever since then, I can't get rid of the feeling that something's following me." Shinji said when that happens, he makes sure not to look back. Now, I've spent a lot of time myself on dark roads in the countryside of Japan. There are still places where there are no streetlights for miles, and you can walk for hours without seeing a single soul. What would you do if you thought someone was still watching you to this day? Our last story for this week is about a man who likes to visit abandoned buildings in his free time. Only this time, he found more than he was bargaining for. This one is called Strange Happening at the Abandoned Hospital. I like abandoned buildings and often go looking for them in my free time. I had a few days off, so I thought I'd go and stay the night in one of these buildings. I got my camping gear and sake and and went out to a nearby abandoned hospital for the night. I arrived around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky. After looking around inside for a bit, I heard some kids' voices and things breaking in the distance. Probably just some of the local brats messing around, I thought. It wasn't just the passing of time that destroyed old buildings. I wholeheartedly believed that kids and delinquents acting carelessly also contributed. I put some distance between myself and the voices, entering one of the hospital rooms and getting my sake out to start drinking. As the sun went down, it seemed like the kids had finally gone home, so I grabbed my lantern and went for a walk. After a few hours I was hungry, so I went back to my room and got the rice ball I bought from the convenience store. Drank some more shochu, got in my sleeping bag, and went to sleep. As the night went on, the cold woke me up. The sake had completely worn off, and I was freezing. I needed to pee, so I left the hospital to go do my business. On the way back, I heard laughter. It was a child's voice. At the same time, the sound of something breaking echoed throughout the hospital. It was the same sound I'd heard in the afternoon. I started sweating even though I was cold, and quickly returned to my room. The sound of laughter and things breaking continued incessantly, and it sounded like it was getting closer. Wide awake, I gathered my things and held my breath while I listened. Before long, the sounds were coming from the next room. The crazed laugh of a child soon changed into screaming. If it were a normal person, the sound would have destroyed their throat. It was like someone being tortured. The scream shook me to my core. Each time something banged on the concrete walls, it reverberated deep within me. I had no more time to wait. With just the lantern in hand, I took off, not bothering to check if the coast was clear or not. As I put some distance between myself and the hospital, I turned around. I saw what looked like my stuff being tossed out the window. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but there was no doubt that something was in there. After that, I never went to an abandoned building again. So, what did you think of this week's stories? Are there any stories or urban legends that you'd like to hear? Leave a comment and let me know. And we'll see you again next week for more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday and Sunday. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.